Nobody could say for sure when the digging started, but everyone in the valley seemed to have an opinion. Old men at the feed store placed friendly bets on how deep young Eli Graham would go before giving up or hitting nothing but more disappointment. Even his father, a man who measured a day's worth by what you could see with your hands, just shook his head and warned, "You'll wear yourself out chasing ghosts, son." Yet day after day, as the summer sun burned high and others waited for rain, Eli kept returning to that stubborn patch in the middle of their oldest field alone, silent, shoveling his way down through clay and stone. The neighbors watched from passing trucks, a mix of pity and amusement in their eyes, half expecting him to quit. But what none of them knew was this: Eli wasn't just chasing a hunch, he was chasing a promise, and that hole held more than dust. The Graham family's land lay at the end of a gravel lane, edged by split-rail fences and a line of battered willow trees that had seen more storms than anyone alive. Fields rippled out in all directions, some green and hopeful, others tanned by drought, but always stitched together by the red earth that gave the valley its name. In the early mornings, mist rose thick from the creek, wrapping low over the rows of corn and wild grass, while barn swallows dipped and wheeled just above the ground. There had always been stories about the old field where Eli dug a patch where crops never thrived and ironweed grew tall, standing gloomy through any weather. Folks still called it Hollow's Worry, remembering a flood decades back that swept away topsoil and left the place scarred and pocked. Around here, history never stayed buried long, settling into the silences at supper or weaving through laughter at church picnics. Neighbors kept a careful watch on each other, not out of meanness, but because hard lessons had taught them that good fortune was borrowed, not owned, and everyone knew exactly whose field had been left behind by time. Eli Graham grew up with dirt beneath his fingernails and river mud streaked up his calves, a boy who learned more from listening to stillness than any classroom lecture. At 11, Eli was old enough to shoulder chores and catch the look in his father's eyes whenever a crop faltered or a bank statement brought unwelcome news. The only child of practical people, Eli carried the quiet wisdom of his mother, whose laughter drifted soft and rare after years of fighting hope's uphill battle, and the stubborn grit of his father, who had seen lean seasons outlast long prayers. Eli was a watcher by nature. He noticed how the dogs curled into the coolness of porch shadows, how the creek pulsed after storms, how his grandmother's stories always brightened on the porch swing, even when her bones ached. He collected found things, a rusted horseshoe, a marble from the abandoned well, bluebird feathers, and old seed packets lost in the barn's dusty rafters. Where others saw the field as a lost cause, Eli saw questions waiting for answers, a puzzle only patience could unlock. Other boys might have bristled at the town's sideways glances, but Eli bore them the way he did poison ivy, itchy at first, then forgotten as soon as the next curious mystery caught his wandering mind. To anyone paying attention, Eli wasn't just a boy digging holes, he was a heart stubborn enough to believe in second chances, even when nobody else bothered. The field where Eli dug was more than a patch of stubborn ground. It was a bruise on the legacy of the Grahams. Years before Eli was born, a spring flood carved out a trench that swallowed half the topsoil and left the rest riddled with stones, heavy clay, and the memory of loss. No crop ever prospered there again. Corn failed, beans withered, and even hardy pasture grass turned yellow before its time. The family called it the Bad Patch, a space that ate seeds and spat up nothing but trouble. As drought gripped the valley year after year, keeping the farm afloat became harder than ever. The money from the best fields barely stretched far enough to repair weary fences, let alone risk another season of hope on Hollow's Worry. Eli's father muttered about selling the land or letting it go wild for good, a painful thought for a family whose roots in these acres ran as deep as the river. For the Grahams, what lay at stake was more than lost harvest or empty pockets. It was pride, the meaning tied to a name, and whether a once proud family could stay put on land that now threatened to give nothing back. Eli's first efforts drew more laughter than results. He started simple, tossing handfuls of grass seed into the crater, measuring with a faded stick and hoping to see a change. But the grass sprouted yellow and limp, shriveling almost overnight. Undeterred, he borrowed his uncle's battered spade and dug deeper, believing even without understanding why that there had to be something worth discovering beneath all that stubborn earth. Shovelfuls of rocky clay and bits of splintered root gave way to more of the same, and after a week his hands ached, blisters puckered under layers of dirt, and his arms stung with the effort. The hole grew wider, but hope did not. Still, Eli moved on to new ideas. He carried buckets of creek water, poured it into the hollow, and waited to see if the ground would drink it up or simply turn soggy and lifeless. When the water drained too fast one day and refused to seep the next, it seemed as if even the field was having fun at his expense. More than once he'd feel eyes on his back neighbors pausing on the road, his father shaking his head from the porch, and the old, sour twist of doubt would creep in. A sudden summer rain sent a trickle running into his hole, only to vanish, leaving behind slick mud and not a sign of new life. One morning, after a particularly long bout of digging, the shovel snapped clean in two. That night, Eli sat silent at the supper table, his mother offering gentle questions he couldn't answer, and his father pretending not to notice the battered hands or the weary look in his son's eyes. For a moment, the mystery seemed heavier than any hope he'd carried with him to the field. It was a quiet afternoon, the sort that settles over a small farm after chores are done, and only cicadas remained to mark the hour. Eli, dirty and discouraged, leaned back in the half-dug hole, letting sunbeams flicker through the old willow branches. That's when his fingers brushed something cold and hard beneath a layer of packed soil different from the stones he'd been cursing all summer. Curious, he cleared away mud to reveal the curved lip of an old iron ring, half swallowed by clay and time. Intrigued, he scraped and tugged cautiously, the shape revealing not stone or junk, but the long-forgotten edge of a buried wooden box. Excitement warred with disbelief. The box was heavy and waterlogged, sealed tight, and for a long moment, Eli wondered if it might only hold a mason jar of musty farm records or a pile of useless junk. But hope, gentle, persistent, rose inside him. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the fool everyone thought. He ran to get his mother, breathless and wild-eyed for the first time since his digging began. Together, their hands trembling, they carefully lifted the box from the earth. For the first time that summer, Eli felt the weight of possibility return. Inside the box, beneath layers of rotted burlap, lay a collection of small, weathered tins and folded papers bound with twine. One by one, Eli and his mother lifted them out, the dust of decades releasing scents of cedar and something sharp, almost medicinal. The first tin opened to reveal a handful of old coins, silver dimes, and wheat pennies, glimmering with the kind of story that belongs to both luck and longing. But it was the papers that truly captured their breath. Yellowed planting maps, sketches of rotating crops, handwritten notes about companion planting, irrigation tricks, and a journal signed in faded ink by Eli's great-grandfather, Daniel Graham. Together they read journal entries that described how the land had once been rescued from even harsher droughts, detailing experiments with deep-rooted cover crops and the secrets of how to revive dead fields by creating underground channels for water. Daniel Graham's scrawls spoke of hope restored to Hollow's worry, and of planting not just for the season ahead, but for grandchildren he'd never meet. What Eli found was not treasure in gold, but something even rarer, a blueprint for recovery, passed down in secret and almost lost forever. Armed with these old lessons, Eli and his parents began to work the bad field differently. They followed the great-grandfather's notes, planting deep-rooted alfalfa and clover, digging small channels as described in the brittle diagrams, and nurturing the soil instead of fighting it. Over weeks, green began to thread through the brown, slow at first, and then a sudden rush flowers opening, bees returning, grass rising taller and richer than before. The neighbors who had mocked grew silent, their curiosity outpacing their mockery, slowly replaced by a grudging admiration. The Graham family, once bowed by worry, found themselves laughing again at supper and sharing hopes rather than fears. Eli's father, for years hardened by the burden of disappointment, began to believe in the stubborn, unlikely promise of his son's curiosity. The discovery mended more than the land. It changed the current of conversation, knitting old wounds and forgotten dreams together beneath the willow trees, where that buried box had waited for just the right pair of hopeful hands. News of Eli's unlikely find swept through the valley faster than a summer thunderstorm. Neighbors who once wagered on his failure now wandered up the lane to see the transformation for themselves, jaw slack as they took in the thick new grass, the eager clover, and the steady buzz of life returning to Hollow's worry. Whispers at the feed store shifted from jokes to quiet praise. Maybe there's more to that boy than we thought. Even the old-timers who'd seen more busted seasons than good ones began offering their own memories, sharing seeds and asking about the journals that had guided the Grahams' work. The county agent came out to inspect the field, marveling at the turnaround and jotting notes that might someday help others facing the same impossible ground. At church, people pressed Eli's hand, asking questions, some with skepticism still in their voices, but many with hope rekindled. His story wove into the fabric of the community, a reminder that sometimes the answers to our hardest problems are buried not just in the earth, but in the stories and work of those who came before us. Through Eli's stubborn digging and the wisdom unearthed from a long-forgotten box, Willow Valley embraced a simple truth. What most call failure may only be a hidden beginning, and a legacy is as much about persistence and faith as it is about harvests or land. Sometimes what everyone laughs at is simply the first chapter of a miracle. What's the spot in your life or your family's story everyone else wrote off but you kept believing in? Share your own tale or toughest lesson in the comments below, and let us know where you're watching from. Every story strengthens this community and reminds us all that hope is rarely wasted. If Eli's journey moved you, subscribe for more true rural stories of second chances, quiet victories, and the lessons we inherit from those who came before. We'll be back next week with another story that just might change how you see the land and yourself.